This Monday with Mounts blog is just as much for teachers as it is for students because I want to raise the question, and I'm going to be doing this more frequently, I think, in these blogs. And that is, how quickly do we ask our students to translate into real English? Now, I know what we have to do a lot of the times is have them translate stilted English because we need to know that they know that a perfect is a perfect. So we say you have to use have or has. If it's a pluperfect, you have to use had. If it's an aorist, we have to put it in the past tense. If it's a participle, we have to have an ing form. I mean, there's all these tools that we use, and they're good tools, to make sure that we know that the student knows what the verbal form actually is. But I am thinking that instead of waiting the second year to actually have the students do that translation and then do a real English translation, we should be doing that from day one. The problem is that our students are leaving first year Greek and first year Hebrew too, thinking that an accurate translation is one that is wooden and stiff and doesn't take into account literary styles and the flow of the English language. And if we don't get them fixed in first year, they're never going to really understand what translation is. So I would really encourage you all to make sure that when you do your translations, do a wooden, word for word, make sense out of it, but then go back and do an English translation. Pretend you're on a translation team and you're translating a Bible that's not just for a first year Greek class, but is for your church. Or maybe make a translation that if you were preaching this Sunday, this is how you would want the text to read. I think you'll find that the two are significantly different, and that a real translation, and in fact an accurate translation, is one that actually reads like English. Let me give you an example here. This is Matthew 13:11, and there's two really good examples. It starts, but he, and then here's your aorist passive participle, right? Answering, he said. Now, this is an idiom, and the question is, how are you going to translate it? Are you going to say, answering, he said, in other words, keep it the participle and indicative, or are you going to actually use English and say, he answered and said, or are you going to make it idiomatic English, natural English, and say, he said to them, or he answered them? Now, this is the translation decision that all translation committees have to make, how to handle this idiom and many others like it, like into the age for forever, or into the ages of ages, forever and ever. Translation committees, because they need to be consistent, will have made these decisions in advance. But how are you going to translate this? If you're going to use verse 11 in your sermon this Sunday, how would you want to have the verse read? All right. Well, that's your decision, but I would guess that at a minimum in English, you would say, he answered and said, because answering and said is in English. And if you were wanting to be very natural language oriented, you would say, he answered them. All right. So one stylistic decision. Jesus goes on and he says, since to you all, and then here's your perfect middle passive, right? And in class, we would say, it has been given to you all to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. Or do you say of heavens? Well, okay, what is English? We only think of one heaven. If you say heavens, you're going to miscommunicate, aren't you? Well, this is just the idiom in Greek and in Hebrew. And so you are going to have to decide, it's plural in the original, but how do we say that in English? We say of heaven. So maybe your first time through as a student translating, you would say of heavens, knowing that you were going to go back through a second time and actually use English. All right? But to them, it, and then the same form of the verb, it has not been given. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out on this is how you translate the perfect deditai. In first year, we would, and I always have done this, make sure you use have or has. You would say, to you it has been given to know, but to them it has not been given. But remember, the perfect tense is about the ongoing consequences of a completed action. But I'm beginning to think that in English, these perfects, the emphasis is more on the ongoing consequences and not the fact that it's been a completed action. So the question is, how are you going to translate it? Are you going to translate it because it is given to you to know, but to them it is not given? I suspect that's actually closer to the original meaning, and hence it is more accurate. You go, wait a minute, it's a perfect. Perfect is have-has. No, perfect is not have-has. Perfect is the ongoing consequences of a completed action. And in English, that's almost always construed with the present tense. In fact, have and has is pretty clunky English. And so again, especially if you're writing natural language, if you want to be able to read a verse when you preach this Sunday in as natural flowing English as possible, you're just going to say, is written. But I would encourage you to think through this issue, and I'd really encourage you, especially in class, to always make two translations. The first one is wooden, awkward, demonstrating to your teacher that you do know that it is a perfect tense or whatever. And then do it again in English and get it really accurate. And part of accuracy is accurately conveying the meaning. So are you going to say heavens or heaven? Well, of course you're going to say heaven. And I would suggest that instead of it has been, you probably want to go with it is given. But I encourage you to always do those two translations. Thanks.